Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to have been asked to take part in this. I think one of the delights of doing research is that it does give you the chance to concentrate on what your field is, but with that comes the loneliness of the long-distance runner, that very often writing is, by nature of the case, quite a solitary task. And you know this when the people who are near and dear to you, you notice that slightly far away look enter into their eyes as you begin to tell them about what you just discovered in the library today, and they're somewhat less enthralled. I should say a little, perhaps just to begin to situate myself, and it does to some extent impact on what we're talking about. My institutional affiliation is to a body called the Irish School of Ecumenics. And when we introduce the word ecumenics, people automatically assume that we cannot spell economics. We continue to receive mail to the Irish School of Economics. And I suspect if we were the Irish School of Economics, we would financially be in a much healthier position than we are. In its bluntest possible terms, ecumenics, I think it's originally a German coinage, and it appears in the early 20th century. It grows out of missiology, I think, and it grows out of a sense that to do theology, to study religious identity now, is not something that can be done purely by concentrating on the internal dynamics of a religious tradition and its theologies and its doctrines, but must also be done hand in hand with a sense of how the world is, in dialogue with, broadly speaking, politics. That somebody, one of my colleagues, gave the blunt definition of economics. Ecumenics, dear oh dear, shoot me. I haven't had enough coffee. It gave a broad definition of ecumenics as theology plus politics. That the people who make claims for truth anywhere within Christian traditions, there's always a little bit of politics involved. Indeed, within our own church traditions, there's politics involved as to who gets to speak for us and who doesn't. So a little bit of savviness about that political sense is always a helpful business. The great Reformed theologian Karl Barth famously said that we should do our theology with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. It's a great phrase, and that's probably a student that I didn't get to in time to say that I wasn't here. I apologize. Now, of course, some of us are a little bit alarmed at the way that Karl Barth brought together the Bible and the newspaper, because the newspaper tended to come off pretty much the worst in this encounter. And whether you would want to say just the newspaper now, maybe you might want to say it's theology in one hand and perhaps a social theorist in the other. But there needs to be some kind of wisdom and intelligence directed around how the world is working and how our tradition operates and how it works. So that's enough about ecumenics. When I was asked to say a few words, it was suggested that I talk a little bit about some research projects that are sort of emerging and others that are more established, and then maybe step back a little and talk about research methods full stop. So that's what I propose to do over these 3 sessions. And today you're getting the first one, which is a research project that's in the process of taking shape. So I'm hoping that in sharing it with you, you'll feel happy to chip in and offer your thoughts on it as it emerges. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background to the way it's developing, and then we'll talk about the shape that it's taken to date, and I would really very much value what you have to say about it. For the last couple of years in ISE, I have been teaching a course called Nature, Grace and the Triune God, which is a module that looks at theological anthropology. And it takes a look at it because it says this really is one of the ecumenical problem areas par excellence. That within the division between East and West, that's a big problem, our understanding of the possibilities and limitations of what it is to be human. But within the Western churches, we famously all fell asunder over justification, which was also part of our indebtedness to Augustine, who was also part of our East-West problem. And it continues to bubble up, the question of theological anthropology. How do we understand the possibilities and the limitations of what it is to be human? So I was trying to offer that course as a way into looking at some of the debates on the theology of justification, because that, of course, is a major issue. And then it began to occur to me that there's something going on here that I need to pay attention to. Because as well as teaching that module in college, I was also involved in something that we've set up at a very grassroots level. Because one of the difficulties with some levels of ecumenical dialogue is that it tends to become a very globalized thing. And that those of us who are involved in it find ourselves jetting off to interesting places. With the slight drawback, when you're issuing a statement with a picture of you and 10 colleagues standing on a beach in Jamaica and wondering how is this going to be received by the folks back home? It's probably something that needs to happen, is that you have to put groups of experts together to do a little bit of hard work and heavy lifting on some things. But the biggest question of all, in whether it's in church teaching or in ecumenical theology full stop, is always that of reception. How does what these kinds of activities are doing, how do they get digested into the life of the church when it goes on? Because I suppose there is an unkind and also somewhat true stereotype of people involved in interchurch or interreligious dialogue, that the churches send us off to do it. And then they get quite worried as to what on earth are we doing, because they don't see us for years at a time. They get encouraging reports, and they begin to get very fearful that the people they sent out as scouts have actually gone native somewhere else. There is the fear that there isn't a resonance or an echo within the tradition. So there's a bit of a gap opening up. I suppose it's opening up between church teaching and church taught in very many traditions. But it's also very acute in something like the ecumenical movement, where seeking reconciliation at an official level does not seem to necessarily connect below. So to try and overcome that, within the school, we've embarked on a project based in a little Irish Midlands town called Birr. It's practically at the centre of the island. If you were to throw a dart at the country, which might be misconstrued, you would probably, if you aimed at the middle, you possibly could hit Birr. And we chose Birr because traditionally it's a very 1950s town, because it still belongs to a time when there were four main religious traditions in the island. There are no new post-denominational churches meeting in warehouses anywhere in the town. There's no interreligious presence. You return there to the 1950s. There is a Catholic parish church, there is an Anglican parish church, and there is a combined Methodist Presbyterian congregation. Baptists are found further east, but not in this particular. Not in this. There is a drift of Baptists around County Kildare, but not here. Traditionally, these four traditions have really acted together tremendously well. It's been a very positive experience. Question is, how do you take that further? Or do you simply say, well, it's good that you get on well, and that's as much as we're happy. We're happy for you to continue getting on well. Or is there something more that can be done? Now, in 1952, the ecumenical movement held a conference in Lund, in Sweden. And there they issued something that's become known as the Lund Declaration. And the Lund Declaration it's always a good thing to throw into study groups, actually, the Lund Declaration, because what it says is that the Christian churches should now, and this is after about a half a century of ecumenical engagement, they've now reached a stage where they they should be able to do together all that they can do together, and should do together all that they can do together, and separate only where matters of great conscience or matters of principle are at stake. Now, it's a fascinating declaration, because certainly in Ireland, and I suspect Ireland is not unique in this, we have tended to do Lund in reverse. We do together only the things that conscience makes it absolutely untenable not to do together. And for the most part, because it's the nature of denominations and institutions, we have institutionalized our separateness, and it's kind of convenient to keep things that way. So we said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to do something in Birr that will be based on the Lund principle. We will appoint somebody who will be a kind of a postdoc / community worker who will work with the traditions there, and who will try to get some kind of common assessment across the traditions of, well, what is it that we think we can do together? And where are the places where we want to draw lines and say, no, we can't actually do that. And this is an attempt, I suppose, to engage ecumenically at a grassroots level and to inform it, so that it's not just a, hands up for togetherness kind of casualness. It's actually something that is informed as we build whatever level of consensus can be built. And part of the cunning plan behind this was that some years ago, only about 3 years ago actually, the Catholic Church in Ireland celebrated a Eucharistic Congress in Dublin. And at it we had a visit from the Catholic bishop in whose diocese Taizé lies. And we had a nice chat with said bishop from Taizé, because one of the things you are aware of, particularly in Ireland where you have an overwhelming Catholic majority, is that there are very strict rules around Eucharist and Eucharistic sharing on the Catholic side. These are, of course, violated right, left, and centre, but there are still very strict rules nonetheless. But at somewhere like Taizé, not only are the rules violated, they're violated in the full glare of publicity, with the cameras rolling and lots of people taking part. So we were asking him, well, how do you manage that? How do you ensure that people higher up aren't taking the bazooka out of their filing cabinet and looking towards Taizé and thinking, no more of that. And this lovely French bishop shrugged and said, well, we've got it accepted that Taizé is the kind of place where this kind of thing happens. That's a lovely precedent. You just do that little click happens in your brain and you think, that's good. So we wrote to the local bishops responsible for Birr. We wrote to the local Methodist Presbyterian superintendents and said, hello, would you be willing to designate Birr as an ecumenical laboratory where these sorts of things might actually happen? Hoping that really what we're looking for there is that if they get letters of complaint from concerned faithful, that they will either take a long time to reply to them, or that they might draw concerned faithful people's attention to other nearby church buildings where they could worship if they thought that things were galloping off in a slightly left-of-centre direction and not what they wanted. And I must say the bishops were incredibly enthusiastic. The Anglican and the Catholic bishop both have experience of cross-cultural mission and are aware that the limits of something like the existing denominational structures in Ireland are crumbling, and they would prefer to see their clergy doing something in the sense of anything rather than simply plodding onwards. So there was great enthusiasm from the centre. And that began, I suppose, to stimulate our thinking about what kind of difference does context make. If you're starting to think about theology in the context of a small Irish Midlands town, if you're going to try and think about what is the connection between these communities, because one of the things they do very obviously have in common is their precise context. Their local neighbourhood, the very context in which they live, is what they have in common. So how do we find ways of building up this idea that it's not just the sort of the standard theological old chestnuts of nature and grace that we often talk about, but we also begin to address the issue of place, of where we are. And some years ago, this had been drawn to my attention by somebody we had running our adult education, because she said, if you actually are doing an ecumenical night class that's been organized by the local clergy, they will want you to talk about ministry, sacraments, Mary, mission, pretty predictable sequence of lectures. If it's a lay-run group, they might want to talk a little bit about the history of the area. They might, particularly given the kind of history we've had in Ireland, they might want to talk about policies of colonization. They might want to talk about the plantation policy, as to why it is that some people in a small town have a set of surnames that look a little bit this way, and other people have a set of surnames that look a little bit that way. How have we come into being the way we are at a very, 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 very local level? So it's trying to blend the two, trying to keep this, if you like, it's the theology and politics issue. It's trying to bring together the issues of theological identity with the question of context. That's okay. We get the sense of where we're going. Now, let me sort of move on to some. If we want to take nature and grace as our problem, this is the kind of the introductory stuff, and I've no idea what you're doing, and I should have asked you, because this is going to be Theology 101 all over again. But Theology 101 is good fun, let's say. So nature and grace are terms over which the Christian tradition has tied itself into knots repeatedly. For my sins, I find myself on a couple of bodies now at an international level for Anglicans, where we are trying to disentangle ourselves or further entangle ourselves in debates over human sexuality. And, 5 minutes into the proceedings, you realize we're visiting nature and grace again. It's as deep as that. Broadly speaking, nature is that which defines something. What is the nature of a table? What is the nature of a chair? What is the nature of the human person? And similarly, grace, at a very, very perfunctory level, grace is in the theological tradition the gift of God's very self in our creation and restoration. I'd written God's self all as one last night, and then thought that looks a little bit too right on, and then separated them and ended up with God's elf, which looked a little bit Tolkien-like, so we scrapped that one. So it's the gift of God's very self in our creation and our restoration. And historically, the problem has been, you see, Germans, when they do theology, bless them many times, they can come up with words like no other fun-filled race of the human species. So this is, if you like, the point of contact. French gives us the point d'appui, which is lovely. Point of contact in English will do as a word, it's fine. Anknüpfpunkt is just not really one of the lovelier terms. But it's a magnificent term in the sense that it puts the question, how do you connect nature and grace? What is there in nature that enables it to be graced? What is there about grace that enables it to come upon nature? And all the way down history, you can talk in terms of all sorts of fascinating ways as to how nature and grace connect. You can, and one of the greatest and most interesting to read debates about this Anknüpfpunkt is Karl Barth and Emil Brunner. I don't know if you've come across their little debate called Natural Theology. It was a marvelous, marvelous little debate. Emil Brunner wrote a little article called Natural Theology, in which he seemed to think that there might be something in human conscience, human, broad, lowest common denominator, human conscience, that might open us up to some kind of natural theology, small n, small t. And Karl Barth responded with the great book Nein, in which he accused Brunner of throwing his lot in with the Nazis. So, we realize here you're on you're on very, 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 very visceral reaction territory. That this connection of how we bring together nature and grace, or how we envisage the creation. Because there are some traditions where the continuity is uppermost. We might say that that's part of the imagination that we see at work in orthodoxy. It's something certainly that we would see in small c Catholic forms of Christianity in the West. Protestantism has tended, in general, to stress the discontinuity. But nevertheless, there's always that problem for those of us on the Reformed side of the fence, as it were, of having affirmed the discontinuity. The whole point of Christianity is that the discontinuity doesn't have the last word. So how do you account for some sort of continuity? So, let's talk a little bit about nature and grace. Hans Urs von Balthasar, I don't know if any of you have read him, he's a liberal Catholic friend of mine, almost spits out the phrase, he's a kind of Catholic Karl Barth. So he's a marvellous theologian, and probably one of the great theological influencers of John Paul II. But he has described nature and grace and the question really of theological anthropology as the great ecumenical problem, by means of which it is the great question that provokes all sorts of disparities, all sorts of sunderings of relationships within the Christian tradition. We can see it at work in the breakdown of relations between the Latin Church of the West and the Greek Church of the East. And principally, of course, it's one of the great achievements of somebody like Augustine. If you find yourself going to ecumenical conferences now between East and West, you tend to find our Eastern Orthodox friends have decided to continue the battle against Augustine. There would always be on the part of some Orthodox theologians a nervousness with admitting that Augustine could possibly be a church father. A couple of years ago, we had a student in ISE whose professional job was, quote unquote, a patriarchal deacon, who worked in a city that he kept calling Constantinople. And he wrote a very interesting essay for us on Augustine. I don't think we'd actually set an essay on Augustine, but he felt sufficiently strongly about the matter that he wrote it anyway. In which he said, well, you can see the clearest proof that Augustine is not a church father, because out of the breast of Augustine sprang the most pernicious heresy that has ever been known in the Christian church. And that is? Original sin? No. No. Worse. Protestantism. So we felt we had some further distance to go with this chap at that point. But the East is not in favour of original sin, in its Augustinian phase, as it were. I was doing a Bible study recently out in a little Irish town, and I mentioned the Eastern love of deification as a way of understanding our salvation. And the clergywoman in this parish bristled at the very idea that we would talk about ourselves as becoming God. Whereas in the Eastern Church, this is quite a banal statement. You know, the great Athanasian statement, God became man that man might become God. So the East has a great attention to something, the language and the doctrine of deification. The West has been quite excited by original sin. And, I mean, I don't know, Joshua does some research up in Belfast. There's a lovely little gospel hall just off the Donegal Road, where where the gable wall has, you know, the good news is the gospel, and the gospel is total depravity. That could have been reworded better, I suspect. But that's in a sense the mirroring of these two traditions up against each other, that the East seems to be stressing our our possibilities and the capacity of our nature to be inhabited by grace and bringing us up to a destiny in God. But it's also a point of tension within the churches of the West, because within the West, Augustine set the terms in many respects of the fault lines that came to break within the 16th century. I mean, it's one of those strange things when you read the history of the Reformation in the West and see justification spilling out from being an in-house debate within the Augustinian order and its universities, and then the next thing you know is Europe has divided, and then Europe has specialized in exporting divided Christianity to other places. So it's become a huge issue there within the West. I've just put in interreligious dialogue and politics as being together on this, because when you get into debates on what is a public theology or what is a political theology, you're making pretty big assumptions around the relationship of nature and grace and the extent to which these relationships are positive or negative. And similarly in interreligious dialogue, we find ourselves having to clarify or revisit our nature-grace understanding. And what I put at the bottom there is widespread popular impact of the distinction, because you can disappear into your own head and into the library talking about nature and grace if you're not careful. But this is something where theological rubber hits the road in lived experience. It's something that is very, almost visceral. Now, I'll give an example from Ireland because I'm more familiar with it, but you'll see it elsewhere. The general Catholic theological imagination sees nature and grace in terms of continuity. The more Protestant imagination sees discontinuity. There was a marvelous article by a Methodist about the role of devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And it was one of the best examples of this that I've seen in terms of expressing it. That in terms of the Catholic imagination, that is to say, a more continuity reading of nature-grace relationships, there is a tendency, perhaps, to see intermediaries between God and ourselves as a helping hand. These are things provided to help us when we're not at our best, to help us a little bit more up the road. So whether it is something as devotional practices where we visit a particular holy well or statue, whether it's a saint whom we pray with, these are all seen as ways in which we are helped into the presence of God. So to the more continuity imagination, we're seeing something that helps us. This is something designed to help us on the next millimeter of our religious life. The Protestant religious imagination, on the other hand, sees these things not as helpful or assistance, but as distractions, things that are in the way, things that need to be removed. Iconoclasm becomes, in a sense, the ultimate example of that. So you have within very often experiences that will have been felt in specific locations where these kinds of imaginations have come up against each other. Those who will have said, your devotion is missing the point. You're being distracted. And it's a really quite fundamental thing that there are some for whom nature and grace live in a sort of a continuity, albeit a sort of not an easy continuity, but a continuity however uneasy, and who might be inclined to say, well, to the physical embodiments of religious practice, thank you, God, for these things. Whereas for others, the response is to reach for the semtex, to get rid of them. Whether literally semtex or spiritual semtex is really not really mattering. So the emphasis here is that in terms of the external expression of a religious tradition, you can get really very different feels to what religion is like. Our local Catholic Church in South Dublin has recently redecorated itself and has opted for a simpler decorative scheme. I think it was probably last done up sometime in the 1950s when there was a more greater visible concern with images of saints and so forth. So these seem to have gone now. We seem to have a nice big building, and some of our Catholic friends and neighbours are grumbling that the church is going all Protestant because the externalities that we would like to direct our attention to and through which we directed ourselves to something else seem now to have been withheld from us. And all the Protestants who go and visit for ecumenical events are saying, oh, their church is looking quite nice these days. As it were. So, yes, no surprise there. So that's, in a sense, the widespread nature of the effect. That this is something really quite potent. And also potent, I suppose, and it's something that's coming through to us a lot in inter-Anglican disputes at the minute. If you emphasize the distinction between nature and grace, you will end up needing what some people might call a very extrinsic act of God to break in on nature. That if nature represents fallenness and alienation from the Creator, you end up with a notion of grace that is in some ways almost invasive. You know, Barth talks about the line that meets but doesn't touch. You have to try and keep that kind of clinical nature of God almost touching creation, but not quite. You know, this is part of the fascinating debate. I mean, that's why it's such a short book, the Nature and Grace book between Barth and Brunner is so worth reading, because in some ways they're within a hair's breadth of each other, and yet in other ways there's a whole universe apart between them. But Barth is always worth reading, full stop. But so too is Brunner. I think Brunner hasn't really had such a good publicity machine. I think Alistair McGrath has now decided to redeem him. So there is hope even for Brunner. Now, this question of nature and grace, I've been thinking about it really under the heading of theological anthropology, which is the doctrine of the possibilities and the limitations of what it is to be human. And I suppose one of the things that we're dealing with in the area of theological anthropology is something of it's a legacy issue, that a great deal of our reading of the tradition, of the Christian tradition, has been remarkably anthropocentric, if not frankly androcentric. And we've had a number of very interesting criticisms of that to try and temper that. Well, obviously, we look at the world and we look at the tradition from our point of view. We can't do anything that's us. But how do we try and keep reminding ourselves that this is us? I mean, Moltmann's book, God in Creation, I don't know, have you had the chance to delve into that at any stage? It was his Gifford lectures, I think probably in about 84. So that obviously means it's prehistoric in today's scholarship terms. But it was a fascinating piece at the time, because he did a lot of gathering up some of the work that was being done in relation to the theology of creation, particularly somebody like Westermann's theology of work on the interpretation of Genesis. Because up until then, you got the feeling that biblical anthropology really was all about the book of Exodus. That if you wanted to know what really defines us in biblical terms, it's being liberated by God, being made free. And you would actually find some commentators of the time who would say, well, that's the fundamental insight into us. We are claimed by God, freed by God, and reflecting on that, we begin to work ourselves backwards to an account of creation. Westermann was saying, no, none of that. We actually start with creation. Creation is absolutely central to the Jewish tradition. It's not an afterthought following the experience of redemption. It's the very start of it. And one of the ways in which he picked up on our tendency to twist what we're reading in our own interest is the way in which so many commentators would say, well, the days of creation that you read about in the early verses of Genesis clearly have the human being, the creation of us. We're the great climax of the whole thing. You know, there's a big fanfare and we stumble out of the test tube and go off and destroy the place. But actually, the great climax of the first account in Genesis is the Sabbath. There is no end to day 7. This is day 7. We're in it. There's a beginning and an end to all the other days, but not day 7. This is us. We're day 7. And the important thing is to enter into this great Sabbath, which is a celebration of all that God has done, not just us. And I can remember trying this out on parishes around the place and getting quite a lot of tut responses. No, it's not about the Sabbath. That's a bit too new agey. You know, we're not here to save the dolphin. It's all about us. So clearly there was something in our imagination, if you like, that made us see the text in certain kinds of ways and put ourselves at the very helm of it. And Moltmann, there's a lovely phrase that Moltmann uses. He talks about how this capacity of us to place ourselves at the controls of everything has resulted in a theory of knowledge that is a knowledge not just about knowing things for the good of knowing them, but it's about knowing them in order to control them. What he calls an epistemology of control, that we perhaps need to be weaned off the way in which we say we know something, but it's a very self-interested motion of knowledge. And I think I put that there simply to bring in this question of how do we describe ourselves theologically? Because there's certainly a period, probably post-Enlightenment, in which we see ourselves supremely as knowers of the world, in which we're knowers of the world / exploiters of the world / civilizers of the world, all of which we've come to regard with a little bit of a questioning mind. So there's many theological ways in which you can describe what it is to be human. Augustine would have given us original sin. I think my favorite definition of what it is to be human comes from Peter Abelard. He said, we are the one species that can smile and sail a boat. It's pretty good. The drawback of giving that to a group is there's nearly always somebody who will tell you that their Labrador smiles at them, and then you have a big discussion as to whether dogs can smile, and we somehow or other miss the point. But there are many, many, many different narratives about who we think we are, and they're all worth teasing out, because somewhere in those accounts of who we say we are, there is the question of nature and grace, and how we see that understanding of our human being opened to or opened by the grace of God. So that's quite an important element in the discussion. Now we're beginning to get finally towards the topic. Theological language we have a place for place. We borrow from the Greeks the idea of topos. We talk about different doctrinal topoi in our theology, the different places of things within the system of doctrine. If we want to go on the Latin route, we talk about locus. And I suppose my question, emerging out of the birthing, is the question of does who we are depend on where we are? And what is the force of saying depend in that regard? Because certainly if you troop yourself into a little town like Birr and say, here is a place where people understand themselves theologically in these ways, in these very divided ways, you can also see how that division is worked out in context. That a town has been built that embodies that division. That land has been distributed in ways that echoes that division. That it's not just a case that people are divided, but the physical environment within which people live is divided. It's a rather trivial but quite funny example. of Irish religious geography that up until the 19th century, the early years of the 19th century, the Catholic Church couldn't build church buildings except in a very small number of cases. And when it started building them in in little towns around Ireland, we have what we call steeple envy. That you can always spot from looking into an Irish town, you can spot that there will be a newer church with a bigger steeple. That's the Catholic one, bigger steeple, bigger steeple. So the very physical landscape of a context looks different, and it embodies the kind of differences that perhaps we want to talk about in terms of ideas, but I think we need to have some other way of talking more broadly about context, because sometimes I think this topos and locus, they can actually reinscribe the anthropocentricity that we were talking about beforehand. Now, I say at the bottom, Scripture saith, because as I was mulling these things, I was thinking of some of the things you remember when you're beginning to do your first lectures in Old Testament. And there is a remarkable consistency throughout the Old Testament that Israel is Israel only when Israel is in the land. That this is not, so when I go on about context, I'm not sort of trying to be all New Agey and suggest we hug trees, though it's fine if you want to, if you fancy the nice young sapling, go for it. But there is something very fundamental about Israel's identity and Israel's location. And it's why, written throughout the texts of the Old Testament, we have such an emphasis on the language of exile and on the importance of return. And that even return, in that sense, connects up to the language of repentance and turning around and metanoia. There's a continuity of themes there that perhaps have been read in ways that haven't always anchored them in particular places. That there is something profoundly incarnational about Israel's identity as being in this land. Israel comes into the land to become Israel. When Israel goes out of the land, Israel suffers a huge identity crisis. Now, I want to mention two people who I'm finding quite helpful on this. And the first is under the heading of dwelling. Joshua, how am I doing for time? What time do you need me to stop blabbling?
Do you want to say some time for discussion?
Yeah, possibly I do, yes.
Well,
I should stop now, should I?
This session will last until 12.
We can go on to 1:45, so have another 10 minutes or so, Andrew, if you want to.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry about that. This is what happens when you build up too long an introduction before you get to something. You end up thinking, oh, that's right. Yeah. At least, well, the slide, what is the Bible? I took that out. Anyway, Heidegger, who I'm sure you've met, he wrote a really important essay called Building Dwelling Thinking. No commas. And it was a lecture given originally in 1951, so his unfortunate flirtation with Nazism was over at this stage. He was now varying the color of his shirts. It's not a big essay. And I think it's worth reading because it's the very poetic Heidegger reflecting on these three words, building, dwelling, thinking, which when traced to their roots actually mean the same thing, but which our rather more technological age has separated out and deprived of some of their meaning. And the question that he's asking is this one at the bottom. What is the relation of building to dwelling and the kind of thinking that results from attention to that building-dwelling relationship? Because for him, building, dwelling are, in Old German, they come from a common root. And for those of us speaking English and who have a feel for some of the older roots of English, we know that Heidegger's beloved word being wasn't just being in some sort of vacuum, it also meant to be somewhere, to inhabit. It wasn't a sort of a context-less. But this idea of dwelling is really important for Heidegger, because our dwelling in a place, you can live in a place without necessarily dwelling there. And for him, dwelling, properly understood, names the appropriate way in which humans live in the world. We're called upon to inhabit this world, and dwelling for him is very, very rooted. It has to do with cultivating a piece of land, developing a vineyard, and dwelling there. And I think part of what we've been discussing with some people has been the fact that with the recent housing issues in parts of the world, that dwelling seems not to be what we're doing anymore. Dwelling seems to have fallen out of fashion. And yet, what does Scripture say? Dwelling is one of those words that we know very well from that tradition. That it's not just about Israel happening to be somewhere. They dwell in the land. They are who they say they are in the land. So dwelling carries all sorts of interesting echoes for us as to how it is to be where we are. So Heidegger is one of the people I'm currently, in this particular case, finding quite exciting. And I think that essay is worth, because it's really a meditation on these three words, their origins, and in a sense how we've managed to disentangle things that are as concrete and as embodied as dwelling from thinking. Thinking has somehow or other become something that happens up here, rather than in our approach to where we actually are. The second person I want to introduce you to, I don't know, have any of you come across Li Fu Tuan? He's frankly marvelous. He's he's the coiner of this phrase, topophilia, love of place. And he's described as a human geographer. I love the idea that somebody is a human geographer as opposed to an elephant geographer or something like that. Anyway, Li Fu Tuan is interested in the subjective side of geography. And when I say interdisciplinary appreciation, I really mean that. I mean, he's being picked up now by people in theology, in art, and other places, because he writes from, he's clearly digested Heidegger's idea, but he's reflecting a lot on what it is to be the kind of people that we are and to form the kind of deeply felt affection for the places that we live. That's really quite important to him. So I put them there in sort of reverse order. Topophilia was 1974, which was quite a remarkable book. I should also say that he's very readable. It's like reading Zygmunt Bauman. He has this little poetic capacity to... I mean, Bauman is the sociologist who seems to be capable of writing English in an inoffensive manner. Similarly, Li Fu Tuan is doing this with geography. Space and place is an experiential reading of, our experience. Yes, it's ours. It's filtered through our categories and all of that, but it's experience of a particular place, that we can't actually have experience without being somewhere. And the quality of our experience depends on where we are. And again, I think those of us who work with a particular emphasis on divided places, politically, religiously divided places, this is something that's quite important. That the quality of the place and the quality of the experience that we bring to it relate to one another. And then Cosmos on Hearth is a more interesting comparison of the United States with its building blocks of a kind of a Protestant Christianity, even in its most diluted form in civic religion, compared to the kind of religiosity that informs a great deal of China, the kind of Confucianism, the role of the sage and the scholar. So he's somebody I'm only new to reading him. I'm finding him immensely satisfying as a guide to the kind of world we live in, who is not simply, because every time you look up guides to the world you live in, you tend to find yourself in company with sociologists or discourse analysts, and you're in our experience of somewhere rather than our experience of somewhere. So he is, I think, beginning to restore more of a balance to the where it is that we find ourselves. So this, I think, are the kinds of questions that dabbling in this kind of thing is is raising for me, and in terms of the kind of research I'm doing. The first is how might a greater integration of place impact on how we discuss the possibilities and limitations of human personhood? If where we are affects who we are, how we see the world, then how does that fall within the discussion of human possibility and limitation? If our fallenness or our possibility to be redeemed is part of it draws on and is in turn interprets and impacts on our place, how do we address place in ways that are responsible and appropriate? There's been quite good discussions of place, particularly in relation to the land of Israel as part of the Old Testament study of it. So that's, Walter Brueggemann, for example, has written very helpfully on land and the land of Israel on that. So it's a case of trying to, how do you extend the discussion of the land and the way the land shapes us into, well, what kind of shape does that give us? And how does that impact on our situation? Possibilities and limitations. And then this is, I suppose, where I've been, the second question there is really where I've been thinking in terms of what I've been teaching in relation to justification. That very often when you read a lot of the literature on justification, it's entirely, it has a tendency to monopolize the language of salvation in some traditions. Or to be, if you're a Lutheran, it is the model of salvation. That's a very anthropocentric view of what salvation is. It takes us out of the context of the rest of creation. And to some extent, there's a kind of a Gnosticism in that. That was something that Moltmann reproached his teacher Barth for, that he felt that by playing redemption off against creation, that's a kind of hallmark of what Gnosticism does. There's nothing wrong with emphasizing the importance of redemption. But if you do so as a way of taking away from creation, you need to get your blood tested. You may be dabbling a little bit in. And that may have some sense for what we might want to say about some of our theologies of justification, I think. Because certainly in the land occupancy in a country like Ireland, the plantation was accompanied, this is just a sort of throwaway example, with a great emphasis on justification, and particularly on double predestination. And as one or two Presbyterian historians on the more critical side of their church have pointed out, that was a very convenient doctrine to have with you if you really felt that you might just be part of the redeemed and the other people might not. I leave you with those questions.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. That's been horizon broadening for me in a number of ways. As you've been talking, I don't know what others have felt, but knowing a little bit about the subjects these folks are engaged in, and knowing quite a lot about some of the particular ones, I've been thinking of various connections of one kind or another. And I hope that a number of you have actually picked those up. So it'd be really interesting to hear what you have to say in response to Andrew, either about his specific project or, trying to tease out some of the connections between what we were doing and this whole area of the context, the place from which we're doing.
I was drawn to the kind of idea of place. I'm doing a DMin, so it's professionally based. And your opening illustration of, I can't remember the name of the town, in the kind of epicentre of Ireland, as it were, and you described it almost like as a kind of insulated town, 50s, did you say?
Yeah.
Which just made me think, because I'm practically based in my research, of the nature of my church. Very few people live. I can can only think of one elderly couple who live within walking distance of the church, travelling and so forth. So, I'm not sure what I'm saying here, I'm just kind of chewing the cud over it, really, but you said that was like the 50s, and that therefore became a good forum for a case study. Now, and thinking of my church as well, is that placement or is it displacement in the sense that, I don't know much about it, but the town you were looking at, they were placed in a particular framework, but actually that sounds like it wasn't a very modern placed framework. And likewise, the parallel being that I minister in a church where not many people are placed physically in the locality of the church. So I don't really know what the question is really. I suppose it's something like, is there a connection between the concept of place and also displaced in the sense that it's not the wider position of place? Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. No, it's a very interesting question. I mean, and even, I suppose, even the way you're asking it, sort of at least is to some extent, is underscoring, you know, the fact that in many ways place is something that we need to wrestle with theologically. Now, my little 1950s village in Ireland, well, it's quite a big town. Burr is lovely. We've also developed a project, and we're expanding it into Derry, which is in Northern Ireland, and to Wexford. And part of the dynamic in expanding it is trying to, you know, it was easy to start off where you simply have 4 churches and everybody knows everybody's business. When you move to slightly larger centres, things are very different. Derry does have an interreligious population. It also has a very serious history with sectarian issues. It also, and when you get down to Wexford, you're dealing with quite a number of large post-denominational churches, which are quite fascinating in terms of their own personal theologies, because very often you have native populations in the post-denominational churches, which, though they will say they are post-denominational, they actually mean they're post-Catholic, which means they're actually quite Catholic, they just don't have clergy running them, which means that sometimes the kind of the soft focus doctrine that comes into play is very unlike what you get in a lot of other post-denominational churches. So I think that's true. I mean, but on another level, even when you get a nice little town like that, you get all sorts of interesting context issues coming up that you might not expect to come up. And a lot depends on how you interrogate and how you raise questions about how people interpret the place they live in. That's what I'm finding. And that the more you get to know people, the more you realize that, you know, this person here has narrated what they think the place is all about and what's happening in a way entirely different to somebody over here. And what makes it more interesting to me is that in the way they've described it, they're changing the physical nature of the society. They're describing different landmarks. They're prioritizing different bits of it. And you feel, you know, even though these people seem to be living in the 1950s, it's black and white, it's very straightforward, there are all sorts of rumbling issues of otherness under the surface that could easily, you know, all it takes is skillful manipulation by some unscrupulous person, and we could have a whole other level of trouble on our hands. I'm not sure that's even an answer to your question.
Well, it's connected in the sense that I suppose it almost comes to a bit of definition, which obviously is blurred, but is their definition of place what they perceive it to be, i.e. 1950s? Or is that actually, they're actually displacing themselves because Ireland isn't in the 1950s? And I suppose, have they got to change their sense of place if they're going to...
See, I think it's a bit of both and. I mean, I apologise for causing chaos by introducing the 1950s, because in a sense that's my designation, that it's so unusual in contemporary Ireland to find a place where you simply have, quote unquote, the 4 main denominations. I mean, Ireland now has more Muslims than Methodists, according to the famous statistic that we like trotting out. We have the census before last, we had a 600% increase in the number of Pentecostal Christians. So there's been huge levels of change. It's very odd to find a town where this seems to have passed it by. But in other ways, it has brought into a more postmodern kind of religiosity, where you have, in some ways it's the church of the 1950s, in other ways it isn't. And yet that, yes, what you say about the place versus displacement question, I'm going to have to think more about it. But I do think that really is an important question, because one of the names I mentioned, Zygmunt Bauman, has a wonderful book called Wasted Lives, because one of his concerns is the way in which we narrate who we are very often creates waste and wasted lives. It creates people who don't fit in. And in these towns, even where it's all terribly civilized, you can see that there are narratives about who we are and ways of structuring physical space that do not make room for other people, and in which we would actively displace, if not dispose of, the lives of others. That's scary stuff, you know.
Just thinking about the environmental directions that you're exploring and opening up there, and I do find it very fascinating. I actually did my master's dissertation on Maltman's God in Creation.
Excellent.
So, it's a familiar text to me, and I explored it initially because I was interested in answering ethical questions concerning the environment and how one might ground them in a theology, rather than simply talking about stewardship, which seemed to be what everybody else talked about in terms of environmental policy from a Protestant and evangelical background. I wanted to look and see what else was out there in terms of serious investigation of our philosophies and our approach. So I totally agree with you that God in Creation sort of stands above much of the writing of the time in terms of its attempt to do that. I remember there's a very strong definition of place where Maltman distinguishes between the kind of Cartesian idea of space just being kind of infinite coordinates that you can imagine being at a X and Y and Z coordinate or whatever, and contrast that with the idea of place being centred on the presence of God. That there is place because God is there, the whole idea. God is in creation. Or creation is more than just a grid point. It is a holy place because God is there as inhabitant of it. And as inhabitants of creation, therefore, we inhabit God and God inhabits us. And so there's that sort of sacred dimension to being in place.
Yeah.
And a human being out of place, out of its environment, is nothing at all. In that sense. So I think there's a lot of really good, solid lines to start following in that direction. I wonder how though, this is where I came to really at the end of my dissertation, how that then transmits into sort of ethical prerogatives and so forth, about how we actually therefore treat the land. There's also this big debate that arises about whether Maltman goes too far in terms of talking about panentheism and what the future of creation is in that sense, whether it does become a concrete future in the life of God and how that relates to redemption. So, I guess I'm just saying I welcome more input on that as to how it actually plays out and influences environmental policy making, and how we seek to respect and work towards a sustainable future for creation ourselves.
Well, obviously I can't agree with you more. I think one of the things that I've been watching has been when the World Council of Churches began its conciliar process of justice, peace and the integrity of creation, And there were battles over how would we describe this creation bit. What was the appropriate way to describe it? It's been a very hit and miss question of reception for finding ways of. Now, there are movements like eco-congregation and other things like that which are trying to put I think really what's happened is we've had an imagination that has been shaped as though religion and religious truth is almost a disembodied relationship between us, and it's all vertical. And, to some extent, that's part of the legacy of an over-transcendent notion of God, where transcendent too easily becomes translated as far away. And that becomes a very big question for the imagination as to how do you hold to the transcendence of God? How do you retain a sense of divine mystery without making God seem utterly disconnected from everything around about you? And I think that's an imaginative challenge. One of the things I do is collect images from church buildings where there is a very clear statement of creation, a clear celebration of it. It's very hard to find something where you could actually look at a stained glass window and say, this is something in which the doctrine of creation is celebrated and affirmed. We do seem, it's a Western thing, particularly. It's a Western small p Protestant thing. Well, it's actually a Western small c Catholic thing as well in many respects, that we're very unwholehearted in our affirmation of the doctrine of creation. That there is this post-16th century thing, particularly where creation was reduced to the bit at the beginning which goes spectacularly wrong, and then we all get excited about redemption thereafter. And somehow or other we have to try and find ways of undoing that there is a kind of a small g, I'm sorry, I'm sort of capitalizing and smalling up the alphabet terribly here, but there is a small g Gnosticism in many ways in which we've understood the language of salvation, which has very often become a kind of escape that we leave here behind. And that's very hard to square with the emphasis that this is where we are to dwell, that God has shaped us out of the dust of the earth and given this to us to be our home. There's something very important and fundamental about that dwelling image. So I think learning how to imagine that dwelling is something that our churches need to work on. It's one of the strangest things. I come from a tradition where stained glass is one of the greatest things we use, and yet so many of our stained glasses in the Church of Ireland are 19th century repository religious art that don't engage people at an imaginative level, except they supply the mood music for our religion, and they mostly feature rather uninspiring images of Jesus teaching people. And you think to yourself, well, really one of the most extraordinary images of the 20th century that possibly even our grandparents would never have seen is that little image of the little blue planet seen from outer space, crying out to be turned into stained glass. I think Grace Cathedral in San Francisco has a wonderful image of one of the DNA sequencing. And it really is a cause of wonder. But it is odd. We don't engage at an imaginative level with creation, broadly speaking, as a Western tradition. And until we can do that, and partly that's a constructive element, but partly it's also deconstructive, that we do need to get into the roots of our tradition and see why did we take this kind of a wrong turn? Because it's really putting us into all sorts of strange places.
Yeah, it's a very strange thing, though, isn't it? That we sort of end up denying our home effectively. We have the doctrine of Christ coming again. We have this wonderful eschatological imagery that's there within Scripture. We have second century theologians like my objective study, Irenaeus, who are talking about a real concrete embodied
Yes.
future for creation, and then it vanishes, as it were.
It does. But it's an interesting tradition, and sometimes it pops up. I mean, one of the most extraordinary resources it comes out of John Wesley, who, whenever he met people who he thought of as being very energetically concerned with living out the religious life, he always told them to keep reading the Greek fathers. He felt that sense of that very strongly incarnational theology, that that you are here, and you are here by the grace of God, and your very here-ness points to the grace of God. That's something that perhaps other movements haven't done. We've lost that emphasis on dwelling. And it also seems to me, I mean, from a sort of a missional or missiological point of view, that it does seem to me that when you begin to spout on about place and what makes a place that helps people to live and flourish, and what makes a space more threatening, you get a great discussion going all of a sudden, and you are beginning, people have very deeply rooted views once they get the idea of what dwelling entails. It does seem to be something that you can actually find a way into a conversation, because I mean, I know from teaching in college that you have a number of students who are ethically highly motivated around ecological issues or around community-based issues, who aren't connecting with their religious traditions at all. I mean, they see us as very strange antiquarian bodies. And I mean, in fairness, ecologically, most of the Irish churches are a disaster. That if we are simply organisations that keep incredibly unecological buildings going, regardless of the environmental cost, simply because our grandparents are buried outside, and therefore, because we worship our ancestors, we must keep a roof on the building. We just simply embody so much that is at variance with what you say is really a key element within the tradition. Now, the fortunate thing is, my supervisor used to use the phrase "reading the Greek fathers." That was the euphemism that meant that he was going upstairs to go to sleep. So reading the Greek fathers was rather unfortunate. It meant that for the next 2.5 hours, phones had to be diverted somewhere else. But if people can stay out of the land of Nod, the Greek fathers are not a bad place to start.
I think that is the way that you frame the question is quite helpful. You said that keeping in mind the bigger picture, how do we understand the limitations and possibilities of what it means to be human? I'm thinking from a perspective of research methodology, keeping the bigger picture in view. I discovered that although I was researching quite a narrow topic of interpretations of the Book of Revelation in Northern Ireland among Ulster evangelical communities, the more I began to engage with my sources and really to develop my thesis, the more I realized that I was actually addressing this question in a subtle, hopefully unique sort of way. Because when I began to think about apocalyptic eschatological language, I began to ask the question, where does this language come from? And it took me into interesting philosophical discussions about the meaning of what it means to be human. That we have, as human beings, we seem to have this capacity to rise above present circumstances and envision new horizons, new possibilities of hope. And this was an important sort of existential source for theological reflection on the question of what it means to be human, what are the limitations, what are the possibilities, mainly focusing on the possibilities from an eschatological apocalyptic perspective. But I think that it's been personal experience of friends who've been working on their PhD research, that they're actually addressing this question in their own unique way. So whether they're writing about Paul's teaching on the issue of divorce, they're still coming back to the issue of what are the limitations and possibilities of what it means to be human, whether we're investigating Confucian rituals and how they correspond or correlate with certain approaches to Christian mission. We again come back to this question. It's like peeling an onion. If you peel back far enough, then you eventually, you might be addressing a specific issue that doesn't seem to relate to it, but if you peel back far enough, you get back down to this question: what does it mean to be human? And one approach that I found helpful is I was reading a book recently by Paul Tillich, The Courage to Be. And Tillich is very generalist theologian, but he said up until about the year 1000 AD, from the birth of the church to 1000 AD, the main problems that theologians were addressing were philosophical or metaphysical problems. And he said that they were addressing what he called the philosophical question, philosophical issue. He said that from about 1000 to about 1500 AD, theologians were addressing, up until the Reformation, theologians were addressing the question of morality. How can I, as a sinner, be justified, be righteous before a sinless and holy God? And they said that there was a radical tectonic shift in philosophical, theological discourse around about the year 1500, where existential questions began to be prominent. And so you read the great classical works in the theological tradition, certainly the Western tradition, which Tillich was writing about. And he said that these works are addressing primarily the existential question of what does it mean to be human in the world. So he divides the history of theology into different epochs. And I think that that resonated with my experience of writing my own PhD thesis. That, yes, I was focusing on this particular, quite narrow, specific issue of evangelical interpretations in Northern of the Book of Revelation. But actually, you go a little bit deeper than that, and you're addressing the bigger question: what does it mean to be human? And actually, you discover that all the books that you're reading, or many of the books that you're reading towards your research, are addressing the same question, and there you can find or make common cause with those who are wrestling with similar questions.
Thank you. I think that's true. There's a. I mean,
I agree with that.
No, I do. Well, I mean, it's when you start getting your teeth into a new research project, you begin to see it everywhere. You know, every time you turn on the radio, somebody's talking about their place and why they love their place and why their place matters. And you begin to think, good heavens, why did I miss the fact that everyone is besotted with their place and wanting to change their place and all of that? Tillich is also responsible for, I think, one of the ways he said, the best place to do your theology is on the boundaries, because we all operate within particular traditions or locales, and in a sense his interest was in theologies of culture, was the fact that when you're on the boundaries, you're no longer simply answerable to your own tradition, but you become more conscious of how your tradition, whichever tradition that happens to be, because we all belong to multiple traditions, but you begin to become more aware of how that looks to others. And that doing stuff on the boundaries, whether it's on the boundaries of church and academy, whether it's between different religious traditions, it's a very creative place to be. But it's also, and this is something that you will probably are finding, that as part of the joys of research, it's kind of stressful to be on the boundaries, because you're on the boundaries of perhaps church and academia, you're on the boundary between the library and your family, which can can be intensely fraught. There's all these little things, and to have a sense of identity that's sufficient to sustain you in that kind of liminal space where you're facing one place and not necessarily any longer withdrawing into your own little community and sort of retrenching it's not an option anymore. You have to just keep living with the boundary, and I think there's a special grace that comes with being able to do that.
Just thinking, Andrew, about the different kinds of projects that people are involved with here. There are some that are actually very directly focused on a place, and for them I think there are some perhaps reasonably obvious ways in which someone's thinking can be taken up and put into practice. Although it would still be useful, I think, to perhaps hear a bit more either now or over the coming days about how in practice you actually research a place, discover its characteristics, unearth its particular ethos, etc. But then I think there's also the separate question, which again you may be talking back to, which is fine, which is what about those whose main focus is on biblical texts or theological themes or something, more the kind of traditional academic PhD, etc. There is a real importance here about our own situation and how that affects the questions we ask in our research, the motives we have for doing it, the end result that we want to get from it, etc. And that's probably a slightly more concealed issue behind all this, but equally important, I would say. So I don't know if you have anything that you want to say now or you're going to say about those things.
I don't think I have anything planned to say about those things, but what I would be really happy to do if over the days, if we could, I'm not sure whether your schedule allows you the freedom to have a chat, but I would be really interested in talking further with people about how their research projects are. As I say, I'm in merely the crawling stages of this, but asking myself questions. Well, what does it mean to get a thick description of a particular community in a particular place? And part of that thick description has to be how it is they've been interpreting their scriptures, how their liturgy has or hasn't addressed context. There's an awful lot of non-addressing as the mode of address. But I would be really happy to take that discussion on in a more nuts and bolts fashion.
Sure. Well, we have a reasonably long lunch hour. We have an hour and a half actually, after we've broken in a few minutes. And then tomorrow as well, it's at least an hour for lunch. So that's one opportunity. And then when we finish our student presentations in the afternoon, I know that some of us have individual supervision sessions booked up. I guess that's another opportunity where if people would like to talk to Andrew and he's available.
Yeah, I'd really value that.
I'm very grateful because it's a classic example of the whole phenomenon, isn't it? That each person, when you get to this stage of research, is situated very particularly with particular questions and problems and so on. So the personal conversation may turn out to be very, very fruitful, I think.
Great. I look forward to that.
Anything else that anyone wanted to add quickly before we go for lunch?
My research project is on the concept of union with Christ in the Epistle to the Romans. So I was thinking as you were talking about Israel, it was only truly Israel in the land. I think it was Christopher J.H. Wright's book on Old Testament ethics and the people of God. I think he puts out the concept of Israel in the land as a possible Old Testament background for being in Christ. Which that is directly what I'm researching, is Old Testament backgrounds for union with Christ. I'm wondering, particularly maybe in light of Romans 8, what do you see as the role of place in a union with Christ or participatory understanding of salvation? in the New Testament?
Well, I'll take a go at it. I'm not sure that I'm there yet, but one of the things that always fascinated me about Romans, I think we did Romans in second year, but we had a number of evangelical students in the class who could probably tell you Romans 8. You know, if you just pressed their shoulder, they would recite Romans 8. Some of them might even have worked Romans 5 in as well. And in a sense, they were products of a particular emphasis in which Romans is really all about the language of it's really it's justification on stilts, and therefore Romans 8 is the central drama of it. And then into that, so that was the kind of, we knew there were people who had this particular view. They were quite keen to share it with us. And then we had a lecturer who introduced us to Christer Stendahl, who upended our understanding. And in a sense, he's quite typical, I think, of a lot of the New Pauline stuff, where the drama of Paul is... Stendhal and co, I think, are being provocative by saying, it's nothing to do with justification. I think that's a sort of that's an interesting line that sells books. But I mean, what they're interested in is the real thing for Paul is the shaping of this new community of Jew and Gentile, and that not only has Israel been in the land as part of its identity, but being in the land has always been in tandem with the idolatrous frontier and temptation to go Canaanite equals idolatry. So the nations, the Gentiles, have always been seen as contaminants. And here is Paul knitting together Gentiles and Jews into a new community. And therefore, all the stuff that we were told was paranesis, this kind of low-grade ethical rubbish that when Paul was running out of steam, he would sort of pick up a handful and stuff it into the letter. That's actually the real meat of the letter, because if you actually want to have a place where people can all stand together in safety before their God, it's actually the paranesis that's the important stuff, because it's how do you live together? How do you ensure that you don't antagonize the living daylights out of everybody? How do you engage in the rudimentary day-to-day living? And it's that, in many ways, in Paul's letters that he frames with this fascinating and very laden phrase that you must know very well by heart, en Christo, that this all becomes formulated within Christ. But this is this new belonging, that all the stuff that we beforehand had bifurcated, Canaan there, Israel here, nations there, Israel here, in Christ, things are coming together in interesting ways, and therefore... But it is very funny how, for a long time, we sort of read Romans 8 without paranesis, thank you very much. Now there's a sort of a shift to read paranesis without Romans 8, and I think the challenge is always not to either-or things, unless you absolutely have to either-or things. It's a both-and-and thing. So I'm not sure if that helps in any way, but I do. I mean, that's where I'm sort of when I'm reading my Paul now and reading Romans 8, I'm seeing Romans 8 not on its own, but in the context of this unfortunate man trying to knit together people who, if he'd had a hand in choosing them, would have chosen somebody else. You always feel that way with Paul. The letter arrives from Corinth and his blood pressure soars, and that's why I think Romans is so important. I think, who was it who said that, Paul writes Romans looking at Rome, but looking also backwards over his shoulder at Jerusalem to see how this one is going to play. It's one of his most careful letters in terms of he's very sensitive to the echoes, that he is really determined not to be misread here. And that's what makes it so important. But Romans 8 is part of that bigger argument. Thank you.